Okay, good evening or afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Paul 203 November 23rd lecture, this time delivered through podcast. You should be able to follow along on the PowerPoint slides that accompany the audio for the lecture, so you should start looking at it now, and I'll indicate when you need to move along the slides. We're starting on slide 1 now. And as you can see, on this podcast, we're going to talk about parties and elections for purposes of review. And then we're going to move on to an introductory discussion of Congress, focusing mostly on the basics of how Congress operates. All right, so I'm not going to engage in my usual deep Trump studies analysis for this podcast. We're just going to leap right into the material. We'll have plenty more to talk about in terms of the Trump's administration or the emerging Trump administration when we get back together next week. Okay, let's move on to slide 2. All right, let me just remind you of the essay question, which is as follows. American political leaders are always tempted to assume that electoral victories are based upon deep and widespread public support for a partisan agenda. Yet the appearance of political power often masks the reality of fragile political coalitions. Unfortunately, attempting to govern through triangulation or bipartisanship is not necessarily a recipe for political success either. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? Explain your position using evidence from American elections from 1992 to 2016. Okay, so let's think about this question in terms of some of the following issues. On the one hand, it's easy to overinterpret electoral victories, particularly if you assume that voting is determined by demographic characteristics, or perhaps if you assume that voter preferences are going to be determined by the array of economic interests in society. So this is the theory based on electoral alignments, closely connected to the notion that demography is destiny. That demography refers to like the basic characteristics of the population. So according to this theory, if you know the basic characteristics of the population and which way they're heading, what the electorate's going to look like, you can predict who is going to win elections, who's going to have an advantage in the long term, though it's, even for the proponents of this theory, would allow for the fact that there can be really unusual elections or deviating elections. So there's another way of thinking about elections, and particularly recent elections, and that's the argument I've tried to put forward, which is that rather than being based upon a party, whether you think it's the Democrats most likely or the Republicans, that has innate demographic advantages, that there's just changes in the population that are going to give them the upper hand in terms of elections, I think it's also possible to look at recent elections from the 1990s into the present day in terms of this basic pattern of polarized elites struggling to win victories over a much less polarized public, a public that does not have the same kind of ideological extremism as elites. And we've talked a lot about this already. I won't go into it too much more detail. But the two different theories would lead to, well, very different kinds of predictions. I think the strength of the second approach is that it can account for the volatility in election results, which you can see just by looking at the chart on the right on this slide. So, what happens when you have polarized elites struggling to win over a much less polarized public? Well, what will often happen, and this is the argument I've made, you'll have elites who are responding to the preferences of their own party and misinterpreting the scope of their electoral victories. This is something that's easy when the victories appear significant, such as in 1992 and 2008, when the Democrats had unified political control and fairly decisive victories at the level of the presidency, the level of the House, and the Senate. What happens in those situations is that presidents have a tendency to interpret their victories as electoral mandates as opposed to retrospective evaluations of the previous administration. So that's the main differences between these two approaches. Now, let's just think a bit more about what polarization means, just to give you an example. On probably the most significant example of polarization is in issues such as abortion, where this provides a nice example of how the position of elites within both parties does not really reflect the public perceptions of it. It's not too far off the mark to say that for the Republican Party, abortion is seen as something that should be prohibited in almost all circumstances, whereas for Democrats, particularly elected officials, and not all of them, but many of them, abortion should be simply a matter of private choice. The public has much more incoherent positions on this issue. So, just to think then about the relationship between these two different theories, a theory based upon demography and more or less stable alignments versus polarized elites. The theory of electoral alignments rooted in demographic change would say that you're going to see patterns, relatively stable patterns of electoral outcomes. You're going to see the emergence of a dominant party. According to my view, the one that says no, what is really happening in terms of electoral conflict is that you have polarized elites competing for a much less polarized public. You're going to see much more volatility in elections. You're going to see a shift in power over a relatively short period of time. And I think that is definitely what you see, whether you look at it in terms of the 1992 election or 2008. In both instances, you see how the Democratic Party, which had for a long time been committed to extending healthcare reform and extending healthcare coverage, in both instances they misinterpret the scope of their mandate, and you see a pretty decisive shift to the Republican Party at the congressional level. And in both eras, in both the early 1990s and after the 2008 election, you would have to look far and wide to find anyone who predicted that the Republican Party would be able to bounce back after those electoral defeats. In both instances, it was thought that the Democrats had a long-term lock on politics and political power at the national level, and that probably contributed to the political overreach of both President Bill Clinton and President Barack Obama. Now, there's other ways of thinking about this. If the electoral alignment theory and the elite polarization theory are the two main characters, even if you say, okay, there's obviously the notion of a really stable electoral alignment which always produces a majority party, clearly that seems like a weak approach, right? That cannot account for the patterns of electoral conflict that have occurred over the last generation. But you could say, if someone's adopting the perspective that really demographic changes are starting to favor the Democrats, if you say that, well, Democrats tend to do better amongst African Americans, Latinos, younger voters, you would say that, well, yes, the demographic changes are favoring the Democrats, but it's the institutional structures and the geographic arrangement of voters, which interacts with the institutional structures, that gives the Republican Party an advantage, and therefore this prevents the broader demographic changes from producing a permanent demographic or democratic majority. Now, in other eras, the institutional advantages have been different. So, for instance, as you might recall, in the 1980s and even in the 1970s, the patterns of divided government were usually explained on the idea that, or through the idea that the kinds of issues that presidents dominate, particularly foreign policy, on those issues the public preferred the Republicans, whereas in domestic policy issues they tended to prefer the Democrats, which is why the period of divided government between 1968 and the 1990s featured the typical pattern was a Republican president and a Democratic Congress. What is more significant now is the idea that the geography of the nation, or really the geography of voters, gives the Republican Party an advantage. And you can see this both in terms of the Senate, where Republicans have an advantage in terms of less populated states, more rural states, but it's also the case that the concentration of Democratic voters in major cities, or let's say college towns, this doesn't affect them necessarily during presidential elections, but it's a real problem when you're talking about congressional elections. So There can be other institutional advantages as well. On the one hand, incumbency can be an advantage, and this can partially explain elections such as the 2012 presidential election. It's probably the case that many Republicans thought that after the 2010 election, where they were swept back into power and had really one of the most drastic changes in congressional power in a generation, the advantage of incumbency at the presidential level was nevertheless able to sort of not exactly put an end to, but sort of stop the shift towards the Republicans by 2012. And the way you can think about this is that the sitting president is almost always going to have an advantage over the challenger, usually because the challenger is going to have to face a difficult primary season in which they're going to be subject to attacks from their opponents, and that which will sort of set up a narrative for the president. I think it's also the case that other kinds of issues, just the unexpected things that can happen in campaigns, can really shift the results. I mean, one wouldn't want to say that the outcome in 2012 was preordained, or that it showed that the Democrats necessarily had an advantage at the presidential level. Up until the end of the campaign, many polls showed that Mitt Romney had a chance to win, but it does show that there is something to the argument that even though the Democratic Party might have some disadvantages at the congressional level in terms of the geographic array of voters, at the presidential level it is not as much of a problem for relatively obvious reasons. Now, if you want to investigate this question about the geographic distribution of votes, just click on the link at 2016 House elections, and you can explore the patterns of votes. I think it's particularly interesting if you were to go to a state such as Illinois, which is right down there at the edge of Lake Michigan. If you zero in on it, you can see how this is a state that went for Clinton in a fairly decisive sense. You can see that in many of the congressional districts right in Chicago, in the Chicago area, you can see how Democrats are winning a lot of these districts by really decisive amounts. Not everyone, but many of them. So this gives a pretty good idea, and this pattern is repeated in a lot of different places with kind of basically the geographic sorting of voters. And this is something which more or less provides an advantage for the Republican Party. It's not as significant at the presidential level, but it is something that makes it difficult. It's something that makes it difficult for Democrats in congressional races, though certainly it does not. It's not an insuperable obstacle. Okay, so we've talked about three main dynamics then interpreting elections: the notions of the electoral alignments, partisan polarization, and institutional advantages. It's also the case that it's easy for political leaders, office holders, to misinterpret the scope and significance of their victories, because in many instances their victories are a consequence of what I'm going to call short-term events, not broader changes in society, but simply about decisions or events over a short period of time that in a closely contested election can really shift the final results. I think that as presidential scholars look back at the 2016 election, people will focus not only on the individual characteristics and advantages that Donald Trump had, particularly his celebrity, but what I think is just as important are some of the decisions made by Clinton in terms of where to campaign or how to campaign. And it's also the case, both in 2016 and 2012, that a major flub can really undermine your political narrative. Whether you're talking about Mitt Romney's famous 47% flub, the notion that 47% of Americans they're going to be Democrats no matter what you do, you might as well write them off. And the very similar flub made by Clinton, referring to, of course, the basket of deplorables. So campaign strategies can lead to victories, and therefore what does this tell you about the scope of the electoral mandate? Well, possibly not very much. Slightly different strategies then could have led to different outcomes. What I think is also important, and you have to remember at the same time, is that sometimes campaign strategies can be outweighed by the state of the economy or economic crises surrounding elections. So even though in some cases, in a very close electoral environment, campaign strategy can be the difference, it's also important to pay attention to the fact that events that really neither candidate has control over can shift the outcome of elections in a very short term. We've looked at this in previous weeks, focusing in particular on the 2008 election, where the pattern of the patterns in the final polls going from September through October show that there was really a decisive swing to President Obama, or then Senator Obama, from McCain in 2008 that was directly caused by the financial crisis. Can we know that President Obama would have lost without the financial crisis? Obviously, that's not impossible. But certainly the scope of his victory was affected by the crisis. And I think that easily led him to misinterpret the significance of his victory. As I've said in previous weeks, in retrospect, it looks that voters in 2008 were rendering a judgment more on the Bush administration and the various problems associated with the Bush administration, whether in terms of managing financial institutions, managing the war in Iraq, managing disasters such as Hurricane Katrina, as opposed to simply endorsing President Obama's agenda. And of course, the limits of President Obama's and the Democratic Party's initial interpretation of their 2008 victory would be shown in the elections of 2010, as Republicans had a resurgence and started to claw their way back to control over Congress. All right then, so given these issues that I've raised, it would lead you to conclude that presidents should be careful in overinterpreting their victories, or rather, they should pay close attention and try to see that even what appears to be a massive electoral victory cannot always be interpreted as a straightforward endorsement for their partisan platforms. Now, if you do adopt that interpretation, the results seem to be the kinds of results that you'll see from the period between 1992 and 1994, or between 2008 and 2010. And that is consistent with the notion that elites are far more polarized than the public. So if when elites attempt to govern on the basis of what is really the policy preferences of probably a small number, or a relatively small number, it's easy for them to misinterpret what the public wants, and there's a political cost. Sometimes it can be worth the cost, but sometimes it isn't. The problem with the other approach, which is to say the approach that was adopted both by President Bush in his first administration in 2000, and by President Clinton in his second administration, you can also see that your coalition is fragile, and then try to govern from the center. The problem with this approach is that it can lead to two problematic outcomes. First, we can consider the example of President Clinton. By most accounts, his second administration, even from 1994 onward, is usually regarded as remarkably successful, particularly focusing on legislative achievements such as welfare reform, the classic example of triangulation, that is, taking on an issue of the other party and implementing something that is appealing to people not only within your own party, but not only the policy success of welfare reform, but also the success of the president to reduce the scope and the size of budget deficits during the late 1990s. The problem with triangulating on those typically seen as Republican issues is that it leaves you politically vulnerable. It can lead you to lose enthusiasm amongst your main supporters, and it can even lead to third-party challengers, which is exactly what happened to the Democrats in the 2000 election. A similar problem with triangulation is what I'm simply calling policy failure. And the great problem with trying to govern from the center, trying to appeal not only to your hardcore supporters, but to your more marginal supporters as well, or people in opposing parties, is that it ends up getting very expensive. And that would seem to be one of the major problems with the Bush administration in terms of all the various policies, many of which we would have expected from a Democratic administration, particularly the expansion of Medicare during the 2000s. So that's one element of policy failure. I guess the other way to think about the significance of the Bush years is that triangulation and trying to achieve bipartisanship on different issues, whether you're talking about Medicare or education reform, that's not going to save you if the policies are not implemented successfully, or if there are major political disasters, whether you're talking about the various failures in foreign policy, or if you're talking about failures such as those associated with Hurricane Katrina. So, whichever way you go, whichever interpretation a president adopts, whether it's an interpretation based upon the notion that you have a demographic wave behind you, or interpretation based on the notion that your victory was maybe the consequence of short-term factors, there will be difficulties whichever way you lead. So let's finish just by saying a few things about the 2014 and 2016 election and try to see how they fit in to the patterns from 1992 to 2008. I think it's possible that some Republicans might interpret the victories of 2016, the fact that the Republicans now control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and the majority of state legislatures and governorships, as a sign that we are entering a new era of Republican dominance, that we're entering a new kind of alignment. That seems very much unlikely. And in fact, what we will probably see is some similar patterns of what we've seen in the recent past, a shift in power over the course of a very short term. On the other hand, you could show, or you could say, that the demographic changes that seem to be giving an advantage to the Democratic Party are outweighed by the geographic advantages of the Republican Party. And if that's the case, you could say that, well, maybe there really is a lot of hope for the Republicans, that it'll be incredibly difficult for them to be dislodged, particularly at the congressional level. On the other hand, the Democratic Party certainly should not be despondent. Any party that is able to achieve so many electoral victories and to control the House, the Senate, the presidency, any party that is able to assemble a coalition big enough to achieve so much, it's also going to be a coalition that's easy to break apart. So, for instance, in the 2014 midterm elections, this is not so much a sign that demographics aren't favoring the Democratic Party at all. It is the results of 2014 are part of a predictable pattern where presidential parties almost always lose seats for whatever reason, the state of the economy, or just general dissatisfaction with an administration that will inevitably encounter some problems. Presidents tend to lose seats at the midterms. In general, and the background, basically to all of President Obama's problems and the Democratic Party's problems during this period is a simple fact that economic growth was not very robust during his administration. Taking that into account, we can see that weak economic growth or a recession is very much likely to give an advantage to the Democratic Party in the years coming forward. Now, in some ways, the narrowness of Trump's victory in 2016, the fact that President Clinton, former Secretary Clinton won the popular vote, in some ways, the narrowness of Trump's victory will enable him to avoid the kinds of problems that afflicted Obama in 2008. From my perspective, it seems difficult to imagine that Trump would interpret his victory as some sort of overwhelming mandate, or that his victory in 2016 reveals that there are fundamental changes in the preferences of the electorate. That wasn't true for Obama in 2008, and it isn't true for Trump now. Trump's victory was a consequence of a combination of things. I think his own personal characteristics that appeared so off-putting to so many were, in the final analysis, a decisive advantage. This is what I've referred to as the politics of celebrity. I think the fact that he was able to mobilize voters on a variety of key issues that were previously seen as being part of a bipartisan consensus, particularly issues of immigration, trade, and foreign policy. And as I've already said, the weak economic growth of the Obama administration and the weaknesses of Clinton as a candidate, all of these contributed to Trump's victory rather than fundamental changes in the electorate itself. So, we would expect then that Trump would be likely to adopt the triangulating approach of both President Clinton and of President Bush, though whether that will be possible in the present environment is going to be it remains to be seen. On some issues, Trump certainly has the potential to work with the Democrats and congressional Republicans on issues that everyone seems to be in agreement on, things like infrastructure spending. On the other hand, the immigration issue is going to be incredibly divisive, not only in terms of Democrats and Republicans, but in terms of his own party. And in the background, we have to keep in mind the fact that Trump's possibilities are going to be limited by the fact that we've just been through two presidencies that have seen rising deficits every year, or rather rising overall debt. The deficits did not rise in quite the same way every year. But anyway, the basic idea is that the nation is increasingly broke, and there is a huge entitlement crisis looming on the horizon that will be incredibly difficult for the Republican Party or any party to deal with. So, in the end, no matter what interpretation presidents adopt, they will face different kinds of problems. On the one hand, if they adopt the electoral alignment, demographic is destiny interpretation of their victories, they're likely to overreach and face a political backlash of the kind that President Clinton experienced in '94 and that Obama experienced in 2010. Taking the other interpretation, recognizing that the beliefs of party elites may not accurately reflect the preferences of the public, can lead to problems of its own. On the one hand, if you try to move towards the center, you can find that your own most significant supporters, or at least your most loyal supporters, can become dissatisfied. Or, on the other hand, if you try to govern in a bipartisan manner, you can find that pleasing everyone can be far more expensive than the nation is able to handle. Okay, so if you have additional questions about these issues of party and elections, particularly related to the essay questions, please let me know. But for now, let's move on and start talking about Congress. Okay, so now we are moving on to slide 3, which has the provocative title, Congress, the only legislature in the world. This is not meant literally, but it is meant seriously in a certain way. Arguably, it is the case that the members of the American legislature have greater influence on the policymaking process and on the legislative process, and a greater ability to shape the legislative process than is the case for legislators in any other political system. And this comes about for a relatively straightforward reason. It's connected to the weakness of political parties. The structures of party discipline that exist in parliamentary systems never evolved in the American context, though at various points in time, parties have been able to exercise influence over individual members in order to create a certain degree of party discipline. What does characterize the American legislative process is a pattern in which the sort of chaos of the system as a whole is actually rooted in the power of individual members and the overall power of the institution. So that's a difficult thing to keep in mind, right? The system is chaotic, confusing, inefficient, and that comes about precisely because the legislature is so influential and the ability of the executive to manage the legislative process, which is absolutely central to parliamentary systems, doesn't operate in the same way. Okay, so first concepts to think about in terms of Congress. And we should see that Congress is shaped by centrifugal forces and centripetal forces. Centrifugal forces are forces that tend to move away from the center, and whereas a centripetal force is something that tends to move towards the center. What this means in political terms is that a centrifugal force is the institutional structures, the electoral structures, the political factors that give the power to individuals in a legislative body. That's what features in the American context. Centripetal forces are forces that tend to move power towards the center. This is something that is overwhelmingly the case in parliamentary systems, and for the most part, it's simply rooted in the fact that in parliamentary systems, parties control who gets to run for the party. So if someone departs from the party in the legislative process, they are no longer going to be a member of that party. That same power does not exist in the American system. So probably the most important centrifugal force, the force that gives a lot of independence to individual members, that takes power away from party leaders, whether in the Senate or in the House, is the simple fact that individual members of the party are responsible for their own electoral fate. So the primary system really shapes what members of Congress can and cannot do. However, it's not the case that party leaders have no influence. And another way of thinking about this is that in the American system, sometimes the system can be dominated by the centrifugal forces and it can seem chaotic and individual legislators going their own way and having a lot of independence. In some instances, in some circumstances, party leaders will have a lot of influence, or they will appear to have a lot of influence. In some instances, the American legislative process will look more like a parliamentary process. So, the key to understanding this is trying to understand why do legislators in Congress sometimes act like parliamentary parties, and why do they sometimes act in a very different way? Why do they sometimes act like a bunch of feuding medieval lords, each having their own interests that are really distinct from their party? I think the key to understanding this is the role of political ideology. Basically, as parties are ideologically unified, they start acting a bit more like parliamentary parties. But given the size and diversity and scope of the nation, it's always possible, and in many instances this will be very significant, for individual members of Congress to pay less attention to the political needs of their party or the political ideology of their party, and to pay more attention to the centrifugal forces, which in this case would be the particular interests of their state, of their district, of their local supporters. So we're going to understand how these things play out over time. The other thing we want to be able to do in Congress is try to explain how the structure of Congress has changed. The one important thing to note about the legislative system is that even though the Constitution sets some of the most basic rules in place, the structure of the legislative process is determined by the members of Congress themselves, whether in the Senate or in the House. And over time, this changes. We're not going to focus on analyzing every historical change in Congress, but we are going to try to understand the differences between the so-called textbook Congress of the mid-20th century, really the Congress that existed almost from 1910 to 1970, and the so-called hyper-partisan Congress that replaced it and that really came to the fore through the 1980s and the 1990s. We should note, again, that not everything changes. Congress, under hyper-partisan conditions, acts in a more parliamentary fashion. Parties are more unified, and the committee system, which we'll see is crucial to understanding Congress, tends to not have quite as much independence. Going further, under conditions of hyper-polarized or hyper-partisan Congress, cooperation and bipartisanship is limited. We have to note, however, that Congress never becomes completely parliamentary in character. This is most important simply in the fact that the legislators themselves play a crucial role in developing laws, but it is also the case that the incentives of individual legislators to stick with their party will never be as strong as in a parliamentary system. Okay, so the final issue that we're really going to want to address in terms of Congress is the role of congressional committees, the committees that do the bulk of legislative work in Congress. And the real question here is whether committees exist to provide information, right? Are they there just to allow for specialization and to allow Congress to do a more effective job? Or does the structure of committees in Congress, whether in the Senate or the House, simply provide another avenue for interest groups to influence the legislative process? And I think it's a little bit of both. The one unfortunate thing about, or maybe there's many unfortunate things about the American Congress, but a Congress that is influential in the legislative process is also a Congress that is going to be open to interest group influence. And though there is some questions about whether or not interest groups have more or less power in a congressional system as opposed to the parliamentary system, there are debates about this and there are people who disagree. The general consensus is that if you have limited party discipline, if it's possible for individuals to depart from the party line, then you create incentives for interest groups to lobby individual members of Congress, to lobby individual legislators, and this overall will create a legislative process that's much more affected by interest group power. Some people might think that's a good thing. Most would probably say that's a bad thing. Under the existing system, it is utterly unavoidable. So while I will argue that, on the one hand, congressional committees are unavoidable, and it is the case that committee specialization allows individual legislators to develop expertise. On the other hand, it's the committee system, not the only source of interest group influence, but it is a pretty major source of interest group influence, and it seems very difficult to avoid that or to change it, given the structure of the Constitution and given the scope of federal responsibilities. Okay, let's talk a bit more about this distinction between centrifugal forces and centripetal forces in congressional politics, and let's move along to slide 4. Okay, so keeping in mind then what's distinctive about the American system is the dominance of centrifugal forces, the forces that allow individuals to go their own way. And really the most important way to think about this is that there are basic institutional factors that will always create a tendency for the American legislative process to be less controlled than in a parliamentary system. I mean, the basic fact is that under a system of separation of powers, where the president, the chief executive, does not depend upon the confidence or support of a majority in the legislative branch, if you have that basic institutional structure, you are not going to develop the mechanisms of party discipline. Okay, so then that's fine. What determines whether or not in practice parties tend to act in a more or less unified way? Well, the most obvious factor here is that American parties have a greater degree of ideological diversity, typically speaking, than most other parties. I suppose you could find counterexamples, but I think it is the case that the scope of ideological diversity is pretty apparent, and there's a lot of disagreement. And in particular, it is possible for individual senators or individual members of Congress to go their own way. We can think of this now in terms of the appointments process for the Trump administration, where already you see a division, particularly on questions of foreign policy, between Trump supporters and neoconservatives in the party and more isolationist senators such as Rand Paul of Kentucky. Rand Paul, probably one of the major things in which he thought there was probably some agreement between himself and President Trump was on the question of foreign policy, because Rand Paul comes from the wing of the party that we might call neo-isolationists, the wing of the party. People have thought it to be relatively small, but it's the wing of the Republican Party that thinks the United States needs to play probably less of a role in foreign affairs. Someone like Rand Paul, or certainly his father Ron Paul, were extremely critical of American foreign policy and have been for a generation. So there's a lot of ideological diversity then within the party, and there's relatively little that the parties can do to constrain it. If Senator Rand Paul decides he doesn't want to vote in favor of, say, a neoconservative candidate for Secretary of State like John Bolton or maybe even Rudy Giuliani, there's not too much that the Republican Party can do to control him or constrain him. That's very different from a parliamentary system. Obviously, closely connected to this is simply the size and scope of the nation, which is going to give an incentive for individual members to just have different orientations towards the political world. Even though we usually think of politics in regional terms, in say the fact that California is liberal or that New York State is liberal, it is the case that politics doesn't disappear in those states. There are still Republicans come from New York, such as Trump, such as Rudy Giuliani, just as there are Democrats who come from more conservative-leaning states. Yet their perspectives are often going to differ from other members of their party. So this creates another source of tension, given the fact that Republicans from New York are going to, say, differ on a lot of social and cultural questions from Republicans from Oklahoma or Texas or elsewhere. So, and that also plays into questions related to, in many cases, economic questions as well. I mean, in addition to the main constitutional sources that make it impossible or if not impossible, difficult for the American legislative process to be parliamentary in character, that makes it difficult for parties to act on the basis of party discipline, there is the fact that the primary system and the mechanisms of candidate-centered campaigning give a greater degree of independence to individual legislators. And the primary system here is key. The fact is, American parties cannot control who they get to nominate as candidates. That is obvious in this electoral season, but it's always been obvious, or at least obvious for 100 years, at the congressional level. Because of this, you take away one of the main weapons that parties use to discipline their members. And again, the candidate-centered campaigning is also connected to the way in which Congress operates. Even if parties cannot directly select candidates for elections, they might be able to influence them, and in fact they can influence them by trying to direct money away from them or being able to provide support for candidates. So parties still try to influence the electoral process, and because it's in essence, parties say to their individual candidates, if you don't toe the line, we are either not going to help you either in the primary season or in the general election campaign. However, it is probably easier than ever, particularly for successful politicians, to amass their own campaign war chest and to develop their own campaign organizations on their own. And because of this, it can often be very difficult for parties to constrain what individual legislators do. Okay, so also closely connected to this is the dominance of particular interests over partisan interests. And you can think of it this way. It is probably the case that in any political system, whether Canada or the UK, there are differences amongst individual members that's either rooted in individual ideology or rooted in the interests of their particular region. However, in a parliamentary system, it's usually not possible for an individual legislator to prioritize their own particular interests or particular ideology over the interests of their party. In the American system, this can be done whenever they like. right? So as we'll see when we come to talk about particularly environmental policy and how the particular interests of many Democratic legislatures from coal-producing regions, from oil-producing regions, how those particular interests really limited the ability of the Democratic Party to advance a legislative environmental agenda even when they had unified control of the national government. Okay, so all of these forces then create a more centrifugal legislative process. There are forces, however, that will tend to make the American legislative process appear more parliamentary in character. Sometimes ideological diversity can be dwarfed by ideological polarization, and this is relatively straightforward. If you have a political system where, for whatever reason, all the individual members of the party tend to have the same political perspective, then it's going to be easier for them to act in a unified fashion. So there are political circumstances in which the electoral forces, social forces, will produce parties that are ideologically unified, in which case Congress will be more parliamentary in character. It's also the case that party organizations try to reduce or provide services to individual members, to provide kind of powers to the individual members of Congress that they wouldn't have on their own. And here we're talking about just information-related services, fundraising services, various access to expertise in the context of elections. Party organizations, whether the Democratic or Republican Party, try to provide services to the individual candidates to make themselves more valuable in the election campaign, to thereby increasing the value of party loyalty. There are also cases, political situations, in which individual members of Congress are more likely to look towards party leaders. On the one hand, it's possible for presidents to mobilize public sentiment or to have such overwhelming popular support that they're able to overcome the more individualizing or centrifugal trends that we've been talking about. And so you would definitely see this, say, after President Reagan is elected in 1980, within a true landslide election, and in 1984 as well. Under those circumstances, members of his own party and even members of the opposing party, the Democrats, were willing to fall in line behind the president. It's also cases that in many instances, political crises will allow Congress to act in an efficient manner. That's in a more parliamentary manner. This isn't always a great thing, right? I mean, the crises of 9/11 probably led to some overly hasty decisions regarding security measures and regarding foreign affairs, but crises can cause Congress to act in a more parliamentary fashion, as is also the case when there are clear trends in public opinion. One way to think about this is that, as we'll see when we come to look at the legislative process surrounding Obamacare, as soon as the Obamacare process started rolling, it was obvious that there was no clear public trend regarding healthcare. There was a lot of mixed public signals, but there was not an overwhelming sense of what the public wanted. As a consequence, the process for creating Obamacare was incredibly messy and very much unlike the case of policy change in a parliamentary system. However, if you have a situation, again, going back to the Bush administration, if there's a clear public trend in favor of something like the Patriot Act, then suddenly the individualizing forces, the centrifugal forces dissipate, and it's easier for Congress to act in a more parliamentary manner. Going further, this is connected to ideological polarization. I think the notion of that broad political coalitions can overcome the impact of particular interests. And I think the basic idea here is that if you are able to assemble a coalition of such overwhelming significance, then it can cause individual members of a party to take that into account and to adjust their political perspective accordingly. In terms of environmental policy, which we'll look at, I think it's possible to see that the environmental coalition was not as large or as stable as was necessary to overcome the sources of individual resistance, the particular interests that led some Democratic senators and some Democratic members of the House to vote on the basis of what was best for their constituents, as opposed to what was probably best for their party, and almost certainly best for the country. Okay, let's move on to discuss slide 5, the evolution of Congress party government in the 19th century. Now, evolution is probably not the very best metaphor to use to describe the development of Congress, insofar as biological evolution typically moves only in one direction. But the development of Congress is more cyclical in nature, moving from a centripetal or parliamentary-like Congress, a form of Congress where party leaders have a lot of power to influence individual members, to a more centrifugal or decentralized Congress in really most of the 20th century, where individuals have greater ability to resist party leaders. There's more fragmentation within Congress. And then finally, there's our own era, starting roughly in the early 1990s, where party leaders have greater influence in some ways, but really parties are simply more unified, thereby making Congress act in a more parliamentary fashion. So what drives this dynamic? How do you move back and forth from a centripetal to a centrifugal Congress? Basically, you have to look at the strength of the political parties, looked at in different directions and different dimensions. On the one hand, parties can be strong in the sense of unified, simply because they have a great deal of ideological unity. Going beyond that, party strengths will be at its height when the parties are able to choose their own candidates and influence the choice of candidates. And also important is the ability of parties to influence candidates through the role that parties play in the electoral arena. So if you can help individuals in the electoral process, if the assistance of the party machinery is essential for political victory, then you're likely to have a lot of direct influence over how those individuals behave once they're in Congress. So the essential dynamic here then is the ability of party leaders to maintain unity versus the ability of individuals and congressional committees to go their own way. I think it's also important to note that how Congress operates in a practical sense depends upon the differences between parties. So in our own era, political polarization has shaped the way Congress goes about doing its work. If you go back to the mid-20th century, Congress was bipartisan to a considerable extent. Work on committees and in Congress was collaborative and largely collegial, but it was also decentralized in the sense that individuals and congressional committees had a considerable degree of independence. In other words, a bipartisan and collaborative Congress is another way of thinking of a centrifugal Congress, where the demands of party leaders are not so significant. This led to some major problems in the mid-20th century in terms of changes in responsiveness to national public opinion, I think particularly in relation to race and civil rights, which is what we'll get to. As the political and cultural context changes, I think particularly the degree of political competitiveness and then thus the volatility of election outcomes, cooperation becomes much more difficult. In other words, the bipartisan collaborative Congress of the mid-20th century was in part based on the fact that Democrats seemed to have a lock, particularly on the House of Representatives. So in that situation where the Republicans didn't really see any way to become a congressional majority, at least not in the House, but difficult in the Senate as well, there was an incentive to work with the Democratic Party to act as sort of a junior partner in government. Once polarization becomes more extreme, obviously that makes collaboration more difficult, but polarization is also combined with greater electoral competitiveness, so that reduces the incentives of individuals to collaborate in government. So that's one of the major dynamics we'll be looking at, but let's go back to the very beginning. What we're looking at here on this slide is a picture of one of the earliest speakers of the House and also a senator from Kentucky, Henry Clay. He was one of the most prominent Whig politicians. I just wanted a picture of a Whig politician. Don't ask me why. The second picture is more important. I have something substantive to say about it. It is a picture of the Hayne-Webster debate. It's one of the most famous debates in the American Senate from the 1830s, and it dealt with a constitutional issue that's surprisingly relevant, or at least one that's become relevant again. It's the question of whether states can refuse to comply with federal laws that they think of as unconstitutional or even simply unwise. So the issue that created the Hayne-Webster debate was the issue of tariffs, and the state of South Carolina claimed it had the power to nullify federal tariffs, basically not enforce them or resist the enforcement of those tariffs. In political terms, this was because South Carolina was adversely affected by those tariffs. The tariffs were meant to prevent or to aid the commercial interests of the Northeast, as opposed to the more export-oriented southern and western states. Now, this ability to resist or prevent the federal government from implementing its laws is based on a theory of what the Constitution was. It's based on a theory of the creation of the Constitution known as the Compact Theory. The Compact Theory is that the Constitution, rather than being the creation of a people, the American people, the Constitution is more like an agreement amongst separate states. So in some ways it's more like an international treaty. And as in international treaties, it's according to this theory, it's possible for states to withdraw their consent. That is, if they think that the terms of the treaty have been violated, you can always withdraw. There's no such thing in international law as a permanent treaty that you can't withdraw from. And even in international law, there is a certain degree of ambiguity, even today, over who is the final interpreter of commitments under international law. Now, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts represented the other side, the other alternative. According to Webster's view, the American Constitution was established by the people, and just as a city cannot nullify the laws of a state or a province, and an individual can't simply nullify the laws of a city and refuse to obey them, a state cannot unilaterally nullify or secede from the Union. Now, this might seem a little bit abstract, but the question really is important, and the question is not so much about whether the people of the USA really ratified the Constitution. That's obviously a bit of a founding myth. But the myths you choose to believe have political consequences. And there are real consequences if you assume that the states have the final word on constitutional commitments. Simply put, if the states can secede legally from the Union, that is, if the states can simply withdraw their consent or nullify federal laws that they think violate the terms of the agreement, then you don't really have a national union. As I said earlier, you have something like an international agreement. So I can choose to leave a private club in Toronto, but I can't legally secede from Toronto or nullify its laws while I'm still living in Toronto. If you nullify the laws of Toronto as an individual, you're just a criminal. So it's something similar in the relationship between states and the American nation. If the federal government is a real government and not just a treaty organization, then the states cannot simply secede, and the states cannot really be the final interpreters of the validity of federal law and policy. So this issue reappears throughout American history. I mean, most prominently, of course, in the Civil War, where the southern states were basically asserting the position that because the Constitution is a compact amongst the states, they have the power to withdraw. And there are various other instances of states resisting the implementation of federal law, directly or indirectly. Opposition to segregation, though complicated, is one of the most prominent examples of that. And in a kind of interesting twist, this issue of nullification has reemerged as various cities have asserted the authority or their authority to become sanctuary cities to resist federal government attempts to implement immigration law. I've talked a bit about that in class, and if you have more questions about it, we can discuss it. In the case of sanctuary cities, the problem will probably be easy to resolve, probably in the federal government's favor, though politically, of course, it's going to get very complicated. All right, so much for the one of the major constitutional issues that was debated in Congress in the 19th century. Let's talk a little bit about the development of Congress. The first and crucial thing to note is that the Constitution does not really determine how Congress conducts itself in the legislative process. Constitution sets up, as we know, an electoral system, a way of electing members of the House of Representatives and a way of selecting senators. Eventually, through constitutional amendment, as we know, it'll be the election of senators, but okay, the Constitution sets that up. The Constitution assigns legislative powers to Congress, though there are some notable differences in powers between the House and Senate. The Senate has the power to appoint federal officials and federal judges. The Senate has the power to try all impeachments, the sole power to do this. And the Senate alone has the power to approve international treaties. The special power of the House, probably the most important, is the fact that revenue bills must originate in the House, bills to essentially raise taxes. We know the basic legislative structure established by the Constitution. Any bill that is to become a law has to be passed in identical form by both the House and the Senate. But beyond that, the Constitution does not really tell Congress how to go about conducting itself. Of course, Congress has to make some decisions about how to organize itself, and the most important decision that both the House and Senate made very early on was to set up a system of standing committees. This is basically a division of labor. Congress sets up several different committees, at least initially, usually to refine the legislative process. So early on, people in Congress would discuss the main principles of a bill, and the committees would then work out the details and the statutory language. So that might be how we imagine Congress works, but it only worked that way from at the very beginning. After 1825, committees continued to play an important role in writing the details of laws, refining the laws. But after 1825, committees became really the workshops of Congress. They were the places where most of the real deliberation took place, or much of the real deliberation. Some differences between the House and Senate were already emerging at that point in time. The House, simply because it's much larger, there are more people, this leads to a greater degree of specialization. There are fewer enough senators, they have to cover the same number of issues, so senators have to address a broader array of issues. Now, it's during the 19th century that, in many ways, Congress is at its most parliamentary. And we have to understand the reason why. Basically, Congress is able to act in a more parliamentary fashion. That is, its leaders are able to have a considerable degree of influence over individual members because the parties play such a crucial role both in affecting and organizing the legislative process and in structuring elections. So on the one hand, party organizations were absolutely crucial in the 19th century. There's no candidate-centered campaigning. The ability of any individual to raise a lot of money or to create their own independent organization is very limited. So if you're not a loyal party member, the party is going to be less inclined to help you in the electoral process. Also keep in mind that party leaders during the 19th century had a lot of control over what people could do in the committee system. So, for instance, if you're a party member who bucks the party line, isn't willing to play along, you're going to find yourself on an unattractive committee assignment, and you're going to find that your legislative ambitions are frustrated. It's also the case that party leaders had a lot of control over the legislative process itself, and so if you have a bill that you want to get through, but you've proven yourself disloyal in the past, well, whether you're talking about the Senate Majority Leader or the Speaker of the House, they're going to be less willing to help you. Going further and connecting this to the Senate, keep in mind that senators for much of the 19th century were appointed by state legislators. So the state legislators are particularly attentive to the question of party loyalty. So basically, if there's a senator who is not willing to support the party program, who is doing things that is not necessarily in the interest of the party as a whole, it's often the case that state legislators simply would no longer be willing to support them. For a lot of state legislators, party loyalty was essential because they knew that party loyalty was a crucial factor in determining who would win elections. Now, eventually, there are institutional changes that are going to undercut the power of party leaders in Congress. Most importantly, there's the slow emergence of direct primaries that we're familiar with. That is the fact that eventually more and more states adopt rules that require members of the House or the Senate to run for the nomination in more or less the public sphere. So once the ability of parties to simply select candidates is taken away from the party apparatus, that's going to reduce the ability of party leaders to control members within Congress. The 17th Amendment, of course, is going to make that crucial for the Senate as well, because, of course, the 17th Amendment, it creates the direct election of senators. But probably the most important change that really creates the 20th century Congress, what I will refer to in a few minutes as the textbook Congress that runs from roughly 1910 to 1970, what creates the change, what moves Congress from a more parliamentary-like system to a more centrifugal system, a system where individuals and communities have greater independence. The real factor that causes that change are the ideological changes that are affecting both parties, the division between progressivism and conservatism that doesn't really distinguish the parties at first, but creates a lot of internal division within the parties. Okay, so moving on to slide 6, we can start taking into consideration the end of party government and the rise of what we'll call the textbook Congress in the 20th century. So, the basic dynamic is that party leaders at the start of the 20th century were starting to lose their ability to shape electoral outcomes. They're going to lose, eventually, their ability to control the legislative agenda, particularly the ability of the Speaker of the House to control the Rules Committee. And probably most importantly, the end of this whole process will be a situation in which party leaders no longer have the ability to control the committee assignment process. And therefore, if you don't control the committee assignment process, really the power of party leaders is very minimal. You'll create a situation eventually in which Congress is at its most centrifugal, its most unparliamentary. Why does this occur? You basically have the ideological divisions that occur within both parties, particularly within the Republican Party at first, but within both parties as well. Those divisions decrease the incentives of individual members to support a lot of authority for their party leaders. So we have to start by considering the social and economic context of the time. This is something we've talked about before in terms of basic ideological change, so we're familiar with some of the basic issues that are creating the split within parties. Urbanization and industrialization, the major issues of the progressive era that lead to an ideological challenge to essentially the small government conservatism that have been prominent in both parties. Other dynamics that are playing a role here include the divergence in interest between the Western states and the Eastern states. This is particularly important for the Republican Party because basically you have within the Republican Party itself, one side of the party, one source of the party support is in the industrialized Northeast, whereas the other source of the support is in the non-Southern Western states that were in many cases created after the Civil War, but states that are based upon agriculture. So in some ways, there was a unified interest between these different regions for the Republicans because the Republican Party supported westward expansion. It supported free land for people moving to the frontier. It supported railroad construction. But there's a real tension between basically the protectionist and pro-finance hard currency measures of the eastern wing of the party and the more agricultural interests of the West. Connected to this are the issues of immigration and inequality. The late 19th century is a period of very high immigration and increasing economic inequality. At this point in time, both progressives and populists tended to oppose widespread immigration. Again, at this time, almost all the immigration is coming from Europe. This wasn't uniform amongst progressives, but typically speaking, progressives saw that widespread large-scale immigration was serving the interests of economic elites and tended to drive down wages. So that's another aspect of political change that's occurring here. And it's also something that's going to split both parties to a considerable extent. So, in addition to these basic social and economic changes, you eventually have political changes and constitutional changes as well. You have the ideological divisions within the parties that we've discussed. You have the emergence of the primary system, and by 1913 you have the adoption of the 17th Amendment, all of which is allowing change to be channeled into the political system. So let's take a step back, though, and talk about the power of party leaders prior to the revolt, prior to the changes that would create the textbook Congress of the 20th century. So in the late 19th century, basically, legislation is becoming more complex at the national level, and you have increasing divisions within the parties, particularly within the GOP, for the reasons I've just discussed. The divisions between the Eastern industrialist wing of the party and the more populist-prone Western wing. So what this means is that for parties who want to try to control the legislative process, you basically have to centralize power in party leaders, such as the Speaker of the House. So we don't need to go through all of these various rules, all of the various changes that were made. I'll just indicate some of them. The Speaker of the House, Thomas Reed of Maine, was associated with many of these changes. Amongst other things, Speaker Reed was annoyed at the tendency of representatives to not announce that they were present when called upon for the purpose of establishing a quorum. So Speaker Reed decided that if you're in the chamber, it doesn't matter if you respond to the quorum call, he's just going to mark you down as present. Now you can see that the ability to simply not announce yourself as present could be a powerful tool for members of Congress, and indeed Reed was denounced as the greatest tyrant since some ancient Roman. But so those powers of the Speaker were being increased by eliminating some of these procedural rules that could be used to slow down the legislative process. What was also becoming particularly important at this time was the Rules Committee within the House, which is crucially important for understanding how the House operates. Basically, the purpose of the Rules Committee is to control the legislative process on the floor of the House after a bill has already been developed in committee. You have to structure debate in the House to a much greater extent than the Senate. This is simply because of reasons of size. There are 435 members of Congress. If you don't have some structure to the consideration of bills on the floor of the House, it's going to be simply too chaotic. So the Rules Committee basically establishes the structure of debate. What I mean by that, it establishes the amount of time you spend debating a bill. But the Rules Committee also lays down rules regarding what amendments can be considered on the floor. So essentially, the Rules Committee establishes the agenda for debating a bill. And that's crucially important, and we'll come back to it. What happens in the first 2 decades of the 20th century is that members of Congress start to resist the more authoritarian tendencies of the speakers. So both Speaker Reed and his successor, Speaker Cannon, were referred to as czars, as in the Russian czar, which means that members of Congress thought they were acting in an autocratic manner. So we won't go through the entire process by which the power of party leaders in both the House and Senate were undermined, but we'll just discuss it very briefly. One of the first examples of the revolution against party leaders was a resolution by George Norris of Nebraska to remove the Speaker from the Rules Committee. Now, it's important, of course, that the speakers, whether talking about Reed or his successor Joseph Cannon, came from the eastern wing of the party, and Norris, of course, came from Nebraska. Now, after Norris introduced this resolution, it spawned a sort of extended debate on the role of parties within Congress. And this is what one partisan, a supporter of Speaker Cannon, said. He said, "Every man who is a man and not a jellyfish is a partisan. We were all elected by partisans because we were partisans. A man ought to have opinions and convictions. He ought not to be a political chocolate eclair." So what he's saying here is that basically you should stick with your party. He pointed out to the Democrats who were supporting the insurgency against the Republican Speaker that these new insurgents were not on the same side as them across many issues. They do not believe in your follies of cheap money, of fiat money, or free trade. They believe in Republican principles. They are here after being nominated on a Republican platform, and they see the light in accordance with the intelligence God has given them to see the light. Okay, so that's going pretty far in terms of speaking up for partisanship. But we can see that there was a lot of acrimony over the decision by many individuals to go against their party. But that process kept happening. And it started with decisions to remove the Speaker from control of the Rules Committee, remove them from the Rules Committee entirely. And the process would eventually come to an end when the ability of speakers to control committee assignments was almost entirely eliminated. And this was the case in both the House and the Senate. Once you eliminate the power of the Speaker or the House Majority Leader to make committee assignments or remove people from committees, then essentially centrifugal forces have taken over. You move from party-dominated Congress of the 19th century to really a committee-dominated congressional system that dominated the 20th century, what we call the textbook Congress. Okay, so moving to slide 6, let's begin our discussion, a relatively brief discussion of the textbook system in Congress, covering most of the 20th century. It's called the textbook system because it's around sort of halfway between this period that political science textbooks started to be written for the first time. And so the system they described was assumed to be just the way Congress operates. So let's take a look at some of its main features. So the first and most important feature of the textbook system in Congress is the role of committee chairs, which is based on the seniority system. And between the 1920s and the 1940s, the relative independence of committees increased within the legislative process. And one way to think about this is that membership on a key committee could be just as important to a representative or senator's political identity as their membership within a party. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not too much of an exaggeration. And what was the committee system based on? It was based on the seniority system. Committees were powerful and influential because of the seniority system, which limited the ability of party leaders to control who sat on committees and the ability of party leaders to remove people who they didn't like from the committee system. And the basis of the seniority system is relatively simple to understand. Once you are assigned to a committee, which is done by the party leadership, you get to stay on that committee and you advance to positions of authority in the committee system it's based solely on seniority. So basically there's very little element of choice. The seniority system is how positions of power within Congress are allocated. So why is this crucial? Why does the seniority system matter? Well, on the one hand, it's very difficult to punish or control individuals who defect from the party platform. Essentially, there's very little way for a party leader, say within the Democratic Party, to punish a member of Congress or the Senate who decides not to vote with the party, say on civil rights legislation. It's also important to note how much power the committee chairs have in the legislative process itself, whether you're talking about in the House or in the Senate. So let's think of this in terms of the role of committees in sort of a relatively simplified model of the legislative process. This is basically how it works. A bill is introduced in Congress. That is essentially a bill is a legislative proposal. At which point the bill, which can be created really by anyone, though in most cases it's been created by the president working in conjunction with executive branch bureaucrats and members of Congress, but at any rate, a bill is introduced. Procedurally, at that point, it's referred to a relevant committee or committees by the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leaders. So the next stage, and really the most important stage in terms of determining the final content of the bill, is where the committees oversee the development of the law and what's called committee markup. This is essentially investigating, researching, debating, and introducing amendments and changes to the bill. Now, in this textbook era, between 1910 and 1970 approximately, the committee chairs had the ability to almost completely control this process. How exactly do committee chairs control the legislative process? Well, it's possible for them to simply not address a bill at all. In fact, committee chairs had the power to not even hold meetings if they chose not to. Here's a statement from Senator James Eastland, who was chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Civil Rights in the mid-20th century. I won't try to do the Southern accent. He says, well, maybe I will. The law says the committee has got to meet once a week, he stated. Why, for 3 years I was chairman. That committee didn't hold a meeting. I had special pockets put in my pants, and for years I carried those bills around in my pockets everywhere I went, and every one of them was defeated. So that's a typical example of just how much power even a subcommittee chair could have. They could simply decide not to address relevant bills. And it's important, of course, that he was the chair of the subcommittee on civil rights, because this would seem to be one of the most crucial ways in which the seniority system, in a way, distorted the representative process in Congress. As the rest of the country, not only Democrats but Republicans, certainly Republicans as well, were more open to adopting civil rights legislation that would address segregation in the South and even elsewhere. Congress was dominated by Southern senators and Southern representatives, not in terms of absolute numbers, but in terms of their seniority within the Democratic Party. Okay, getting back to the power of committee chairs. So we already know they determine whether committees meet at all. The chairs determine all staff. They determine who gets staff. They make all staff appointments, and they control the resources available to individual members. Going further, the committee chairs decide what subcommittees are going to be created and what bills will be referred to them. And then chairs of the subcommittees, it's also determined by seniority. So as I said, the essential problem during the textbook era was the fact that because of the seniority system, the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party had an outside level of influence within the party. And it wasn't based on numbers alone. It was on the fact that because of the seniority, they often controlled key chairs and subcommittee chairs in both the Senate and the House. Think of it this way. In 1950, about midway through this period, there are 15 main Senate committees, and 13 were held by Southerners, or close allies of Southerners. And the remaining 2 committees were the District of Columbia Committee, which basically just deals with legislation for the District of Columbia, and the Rules Committee, which is not important in the Senate at all. All these important subcommittees were dominated by Southern Democrats. And adding to sort of their institutional power was, of course, their experience. The Southern Democrats had been there usually for a longer period of time than their erstwhile allies within the Democratic Party, and this allowed them to have an intimate familiarity with the procedural rules, which gave them additional power within the legislative process. In some ways, the ultimate power for the southern wing of the Democratic Party, only relevant in the Senate, is the role of the filibuster. The filibuster at that point in time was not used regularly, but it was always there as a presence. And keep in mind what the filibuster is. Essentially, a filibuster is a claim that you're going to keep on speaking, not allow a bill to come to a vote, and it can be overturned with a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Basically, this allowed conservative Southern Democrats, often working with conservative Republicans, or at least expecting their support, to prevent civil rights legislation from passing in the Senate. Okay, let's talk a bit more then about the significance of the seniority system. We've already seen how it empowers committee chairs and what committee chairs can do in the legislative process. We also know how the seniority system, given the pattern of electoral politics, gave an outsized advantage to Southern Democrats. We should also note that the seniority system affected conference committees. And let me just explain a little bit about conference committees and why they're important. We've talked about sort of the basic stages of the legislative process. We've talked about that the first stage is the referral of a bill, then it's considered by a committee in what's called a markup, essentially, and then it proceeds to the House or Senate floor in slightly different ways. That gets kind of complicated. We'll get back to that. This is where the Rules Committee comes in the House, and the Senate requires unanimous consent agreements. We'll talk about that a bit later. Now, what happens when the House and the Senate produce bills that are basically on the same subject matter, but they don't end up being identical? Well, then you have to have a conference committee, which is basically a committee made up of senators and representatives from the two houses, or from the House and the Senate, rather, and they have to reconcile the differences between those bills, and then the bills have to be sent back to the House and Senate to be passed so that they're in identical form. In the mid-20th century, and probably even later, those conference committees tended to be dominated by the most senior members in both parties. So because of this, the seniority system gave another advantage, particularly to the more conservative segregationist Democrats. Okay, so that's the significance of the seniority system within Congress. One could go even further. It had a real effect even on the social life of senators, particularly senators who really demanded a lot of deference from their junior colleagues. Several other dynamics that are affecting Congress during the textbook period is the fact of limited electoral competition and the incumbency advantage, which we've talked about. It's the simple fact that, in comparison particularly with the late 19th century, Congress, and in some ways especially the House, was increasingly dominated by legislators who, for all intents and purposes, did not face serious electoral competition. Yes, there were always swing districts that moved back and forth between the party. It's not as if there was no electoral competition, but incumbents tended to get reelected. This, of course, is particularly important in the South, because in the South it's essentially a one-party state in all of the southern states. So if you bring together the incumbency advantage and the seniority system, you can see the importance of this Southern fact within the Democratic Party. Now that's eventually going to create a problem for the Democratic Party, because over time, the most powerful members of the party within Congress for the Democrats are Southern Democrats who are out of line not only with public opinion as a whole, but even with a majority opinion within the Democratic Party, and of course particularly on racial issues. Okay, that comes about the late 1950s, 1960s. Other developments have shaped Congress in the 20th century as well, and that's the rise of presidential leadership in the 20th century based upon delegation of legislative power from Congress to the executive branch. Now, it is true that the mid-20th century was not the first time Congress began to delegate what was in essence the power to make law to the executive branch. At earlier stages, there were various forms of government by commission, which is basically Congress saying to an executive branch agency or commission, you have the power to make rules over a certain area of public life. So, for instance, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, these things had emerged relatively early. The Federal Reserve System, which we'll have a chance to talk about next term. What was happening, however, in the mid-20th century is that government by commission, government by bureaucracy was expanding at a really unprecedented rate. Basically, almost all forms of transportation, forms of communication, forms of power, rules regarding credit, investment, banking, and labor unions, many of these specific rules were now crafted not by Congress itself, but by executive branch bureaucracies. It's another way of thinking about it is that it's not only the case that Congress is giving this power to the executive branch, but in many cases, the presidency and the bureaucracy are setting the overall legislative agenda. This is so familiar to us now, the notion that the president will initiate the legislative agenda. It's important to note, in some ways, it's unusual. Not entirely unusual. In the 19th century, the degree in which presidents would attempt to shape the legislative process would vary, but particularly by the time of Franklin Roosevelt, or even earlier, really in the First World War under Woodrow Wilson as well, presidents would come to Congress with a legislative agenda and try to shape the legislative agenda as opposed to merely executing Congress's will. In some cases, particularly during times of war, presidents threatened to usurp the legislative powers of Congress entirely. Now consider this message which was sent by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II to Congress when Congress was hesitating about some of his plans for imposing price ceilings on agricultural goods. He said, "I ask the Congress to take this action by the 1st of October, Inaction on your part will leave me with an inescapable responsibility to the people of this country to see to it that the war effort is no longer imperiled by the threat of economic chaos. In the event that the Congress shall fail to act and act adequately, I shall accept the responsibility and I will act. At the same time that farm prices are stabilized, wages can and will be stabilized also. This I will do. So this is an extreme outlier, as they say. This is an unusual circumstances in the midst of war. Typically, presidents would not threaten to act entirely independently of Congress, but in many instances, Congress would give the president the power to act independently of Congress. The best example of this is the National Industrial Recovery Act of the 1930s. This was passed after Franklin Roosevelt's landslide victory in the midst of the Great Depression in 1932. And one way to think about this is that the National Industrial Recovery Act is not really a law. It's not really a law because it doesn't set down specific rules that you are used to guide your conduct. It doesn't require specific actions in itself. It doesn't specify specific penalties in itself, I don't believe. What this act does is that it grants the executive branch the power to create law. Specifically, it granted the executive branch the power to create codes of competition in various American industries. Congress gave the president the power to make the rules that would govern economic life. Now, this was not exactly unprecedented. There had been some more narrowly crafted acts which had granted regulatory power or regulatory rulemaking power to the executive branch. And it's also the case that the National Industrial Act was overturned in large part. But that new style of legislation, based on the delegation of legislative power, was becoming the norm, even if the NIRA was an exaggerated example of it. So keep in mind the basic notion here. Instead of making the specific rules that will govern conduct, instead of making the specific laws, Congress now tends to delegate areas of responsibility to the executive branch, leaving it to executive branch agencies guided by the president, leaving it to them to make the rules that govern what people are allowed to do or not. So this starts to affect the focus of members of Congress. We can think about this in terms of specialization. So what's happening during the textbook era, as I've already mentioned, is that Congress is essentially ceding overall legislative leadership to the president. Rather than Congress having its own legislative agenda, it's essentially responding to what the president wants. It's not always giving the president what they want, but the president is the leader now, the leader in the legislative process, which was a little bit unusual. What's also happening, of course, is that the overall legislative agenda of Congress is expanding. The scope of the national government power is expanding. Government is becoming more complex. And in order to address this, members of Congress become increasingly specialized. In the 19th century, the further you go back in time, members of Congress are generalist legislators. They debate issues in Congress. Some of the specifics are determined by committees, but everyone has a sense that they have a handle on the specifics of the law. As government becomes more complex, as federal jurisdiction extends further and further, as government jurisdiction becomes intertwined, it becomes impossible for any person to simply be a generalist. Specialization takes over. Now, this is a little bit less true in the Senate than in the House, but it still matters. Now, another way to think about this is that, in a way, Congress starts to be a mirror image of the executive branch. The executive branch is increasingly made up of separate bureaucracies responsible for a specific area of conduct, a specific area of social, political, legal life, and members of Congress start to specialize as well. The question is whether this works. And if you think about it for a second, you can see part of the problem. On the one hand, you can see that it's necessary, if you're going to have an incredibly complex national government, for both bureaucrats and legislators to specialize. But on the other hand, there's still the question of whether anyone is taking into account the coherence of legislation as a whole. Perhaps it's impossible. Okay, so connected to this, as Congress plays a little bit less of a role in creating specific rules, a little bit less of a role in actually legislating, its role in overseeing the executive branch expands. So as you go further and further into the 20th century, members of Congress they've given legislative leadership to the president. The presidency and the bureaucracy plays more of a role in creating bills, and in many cases, much more of a role in actually implementing policy, creating specific rules. But Congress, because of this, because of the expanded executive power, is playing more and more of a role in overseeing the executive branch, whether simply reviewing spending decisions, reviewing regulatory decisions in the bureaucracy and the executive branch, or investigating the executive branch for malfeasance. I don't have too much more to say about this right now. This is something we'll return to when we discuss the presidency and the bureaucracy, but just note that it's not as if Congress or members of Congress simply write a law that says now the president gets to create rules within the executive branch, now the bureaucracy gets to make decisions. They still keep working. They create vaguer laws that delegate power, but they also spend much more time overseeing and investigating the now much more powerful executive branch. Something else that members of Congress start to focus on more than legislating or leading the legislative process is constituency service and pork barrel politics. And this is relatively straightforward. Constituency service refers to the fact that members of Congress now have this much more important role in helping their constituents deal with the federal government. Basically just helping them deal with the federal bureaucracy, whether you're talking about businesses or citizens or even state governments. And closely connected to this is the role of pork barrel spending. Members of Congress spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to direct as much federal money to their own states and districts as possible. Now, these two things are connected to the incumbency advantage, because basically, by engaging in constituency service, you're creating a link with your voters, and the longer-serving members are typically better at working with the federal government and helping out their constituents, and they're almost certainly better at making sure that federal money, the pork barrel, gets directed to their states and to their districts. Okay, now I want to continue our discussion of Congress on to slide 8 by looking at some aspects of congressional committee policy making and using the concepts of rent-seeking and log rolling to try to explain what Congress does when it acts through its committee-based systems. This is going to be a presentation of Congress at its most negative and least flattering, but nevertheless it's an important part of it. Now, from our previous discussion, I hope you'll understand that the power of the Southern Democratic segregationists within the textbook system of Congress was obviously the worst aspect of the political system. But we have to understand there are other problems as well. So as we recall from our lectures on federalism, we know that federal power expanded in the 20th century. And what happened as federal power expanded is that it basically revealed that decision-making in Congress was open to interest group influence. In essence, congressional decision-making was open to the tyranny of minority faction, something that James Madison had not exactly anticipated. James Madison had assumed that in a democratic system, it would be difficult and unusual for a numerical minority to do something that went against the rights or interests of the majority. Why is that? Well, that's just how democracy operates. The majority is usually going to vote down policies that either are not in its interests or affect its own rights. That won't always be the case. There can be instances where the majority does not quite understand its own interest, but typically that's going to be the case. However, we also have to remember that Madison thought there were other limits on the national government, not just limits created by the system of representation and majority will. He thought the national government would have limited jurisdiction. It had limited ability to make laws. There's only going to be enumerated powers. Keep in mind as well that for Madison, if not for all of his contemporaries, there were strict limits on what the federal government could spend money on. So he, for one, had a strict interpretation of the spending power. And further, we should also remember that for Madison, there were limits on the taxation power of the federal government. Well, as we know, by the mid-20th century, all those limits were gone. And without those limits in place, some of the defects of congressional decision-making were revealed. Now, it's important to remember that corruption had always existed in congressional politics. The national government had always had the power to create tariffs, for instance, and it is highly unlikely that those tariffs served the interests of the nation as a whole. The trade barriers of the 19th century might have had some plausible public justification at the very beginning, but by the end of the 19th century and certainly into the 20th century, it was pretty much evident to most economists and most policymakers that these trade barriers, these tariffs, were only benefiting manufacturing interests and industrialists who were already well off. So that problem of corruption was always there. The tendency of Congress to respond to narrow, well-organized interests at the expense of the public interest as a whole. The problem is that as national government power expanded, as the legislative jurisdiction of the federal government expanded, and certainly the taxation power of the federal government expanded, the power of the government to spend lots of money, the problems of congressional decision-making became much more apparent and were extended to broader areas of policy. The basic problem is this: if there are no limits on the scope of federal legislative power or taxation power, Congress is susceptible to interest group influence. In fact, it's always susceptible to interest group influence. What limits it, for the most part, or at least a major limit on that power, was the jurisdictional limits and the taxation limits on the federal government. What does it mean when you have a government that's susceptible to interest group influence? It means you end up with a government based upon, or rather public policy, based upon rent-seeking and log rolling, as opposed to government based on the public interest. And we should try to understand these two essential concepts. The basic idea of rent-seeking is this: most of actual politics is about interest, specifically economic interests. And what do economic interest groups seek? Well, they seek rents, which is a shorthand for economic gains that you would not be given in the ordinary course of market competition, which is to say, you seek to have an additional economic benefit provided by the state for your interest group. So, for instance, let's take the example of a university professor, such as myself. If I'm acting solely on the basis of economic self-interest, which of course I don't, as a university professor, I want to have rules that prevent competition with the university system. I want to prevent people without PhDs from teaching at a university. I want to make online education illegal. I want it to be illegal to hire anyone who doesn't have a bachelor's degree, and so on and so forth. I want, in other words, to make my own skills more valuable than they would otherwise be. Now, imagine that tendency extended throughout every group in the economy, and you have a basic understanding of the most basic political problems. Log rolling, as a concept, helps to explain why public policy as a whole often seems to reflect the desires of rent-seeking interest groups as opposed to the public interest. The basic idea of log rolling within the committee system in the American Congress is this: specialization in one area of policy will benefit your constituents if you're a politician. But the problem is, how exactly do you get Congress as a whole to accept the special deals that you're providing for your most valued constituents? And the answer is log rolling, which basically means trading votes across issues that allows everyone to get a piece of the legislative action. Now, we're going to consider this in light of the politics of agricultural subsidies. And before you turn off the podcast, let me just explain why. You might think, wow, agricultural subsidies, agricultural policy, how could I possibly care about this? Well, think of it this way. You care about power. You care about money. Do you care about how people use power to acquire money? Of course you do. In which case, you should care about agricultural subsidies, because they help to explain one of the basic or most clear flaws of congressional policymaking. All right, so remember, we're speaking about this in terms of the textbook Congress of the 20th century. Won't go through the entire 20th century development of agricultural policy in the United States, though there is a fair amount of continuity. We'll just look at how the agricultural policy regime, based upon rent-seeking and log rolling, gets established in the middle part of the 20th century. So, agricultural prices decline after World War I in the United States and elsewhere, and farmers' organizations work to establish more extensive intervention into the agricultural markets. Basically, interest groups organize and they're pleading with the federal government to regulate the market, which is to say they're organized for the purposes of rent seeking. They want laws to be introduced that will restrict production and increase the prices of agricultural products, or basically provide subsidies to a broader array of farmers and the agricultural industry as a whole. This doesn't work through the 1920s, but by the 1930s, farmers' interest groups are rewarded with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the Agricultural Adjustment Act does just what I was talking about previously. It essentially replaces market competition with government-sponsored control of economic competition, with the explicit purpose of either raising the prices of agricultural products or providing direct government subsidies for farmers should agricultural prices drop. The question is whether this makes much sense from the perspective of the overall or general public interest. And most policy analysts and certainly most economists would say no. It wouldn't make any sense, for instance, for all of the pizza makers in a given city to form a cartel that limits the entry of new pizzerias and prohibits competition based upon price. There's no possible way that could be justified on the basis of the public interest, though of course it could be justified based on the interest of the pizzeria owners. That is, it's not really justifiable at all. It's factional politics. So, what happens under the new agricultural policy regime? Well, the federal government subsidizes farmers in many instances not to farm, and many of the details are worked out by local boards of farmers. The public ends up paying more for food without necessarily realizing why, and farmers get more money for less work with less competition. There are many ways in which the effects of these policies were unexpected. We can't get into all of them. Keep in mind that policies such as the agricultural policies created during the New Deal were also affected by the seniority system and the exaggerated power of Southern Democrats in Congress. So in many instances, these policies were crafted so that all of the benefits would flow to large-scale landowners in the South, as opposed to tenant farmers or sharecroppers who tended to be African American. And that was not an unanticipated effect of the policy. That was absolutely intended. Now, fortunately, much of the original Agricultural Adjustment Act was struck down by the courts, but new forms of agricultural subsidies were introduced by Congress, and almost every president in the middle part of the 20th century was aware that these agricultural subsidies were unjustified, and almost every president failed in trying to reform them. So, the basic problem again is this. Interest groups want to use the power of the state to increase their own wealth. This is rent seeking, right? And the key to success of the agricultural lobby, at least in the mid-20th century, is that the agricultural regions of the country were politically up for grabs by both parties, right? So because of this, it was extraordinarily dangerous, or at least potentially dangerous, for members of Congress to turn against those regions. So there was basically a bipartisan consensus on flawed agricultural policies. And it's interesting to consider why presidents were more opposed to these subsidies. I think it's probably the case that presidents, because they have essentially a national constituency, are less responsive to very narrow interests. So in the case of the president, who has to be concerned with the interest of the public as a whole, they were more likely to push back against these policies. But unfortunately for members of Congress, and thinking in terms of their own political majorities or their potential for attaining a political majority, they were more focused on maintaining the support of agricultural regions. Okay, so the question then is, why exactly are policies that are basically unjustified, it's not really clear how they service the public good, how are they maintained in practice? Well, in one way it's easy to understand. We see that both parties thinking in terms of the political dangers of acting against lobbying, against the agricultural lobby. And this affected the politics of reform. The Republican Party, by the late 1940s and 1950s, was at least in theory opposed to setting prices for agricultural goods and giving subsidies to interest groups that don't really need it. But they knew in practice that they would be hard hit politically if they rejected the demands of the agricultural lobby, so they didn't. And even in instances where Democratic presidents or Republican presidents tried to introduce alternatives, right, that made a little bit more sense, maybe just a direct grant to farming families as opposed to weird price controls that distort the overall market. Well, even in those instances, the agricultural lobby and their supporters rejected it because they didn't want to make the policies too transparent, right? The advantage of the price controls and price supports is that they were extraordinarily complicated. No one really saw how they worked. But suddenly, if you replace those policies with just a direct grant to farmers, on the one hand, it wouldn't benefit some of the large businesses. But on the other hand, it would be the policy would be too easy for the public to understand, and it would attract political attention. So, we still have the question, though, of why Congress as a whole is so amenable to basically interest group politics of this kind. And the answer essentially is the legislative log rule. What is a legislative log rule? It's simply trading across issues, trading favors for other favors. In other words, though members of the Agricultural Committee, they want to make their own corrupt deals, more or less, with the agricultural lobby, members from non-agricultural districts or members serving on other committees have their own special arrangements that they want to make with their own constituents. So in essence, they trade across these issues. And everyone defers to the expertise of the individual committees in order to get what they want. So this is essentially a legislative log rule. Though it can be the legislative log rule can be defined in different ways. I think most political scientists probably define a log rule as something that's involved in passing a single piece of legislation. I'm defining it more broadly here to just include the trade-offs across different committees that allow interest groups politics to flourish. So, a legislative log rule is when one legislator or group of legislators accepts some provisions or policies, even though they don't support those policies themselves, in exchange for support on some other, usually unrelated policy. Now, why is this called a log rule? It's based upon the practice of the early pioneers of everyone getting together to help everyone else out when they need to build a cabin out of logs. But if you extend the metaphor to the legislative process, I think this means that the pioneers are the legislators and the interest groups, and the general public is the forest. At any rate, that's the basic idea of a log rule. Now, in the case of agricultural policy, it is sometimes possible, and in fact was often possible, to create a giant legislative log rule based upon agricultural interests alone. In other words, there are so many different kinds of agricultural products in so many places in the nation that if you provide subsidies and price supports for everybody, then you can in fact capture a majority of Congress, and that's in essence how dysfunctional agricultural policy was maintained for most of the 20th century, and really how it's maintained today as well. So this is how a Democratic lawmaker describes the agricultural policy log rule, and this would characterize almost any agricultural bill from the middle part of the 20th century, even up into the 21st century. Keep in mind that the elements of the agricultural policy, price supports, acreage allowances, and various marketing agreements, they have no purpose except to transfer wealth from the public, not simply to farmers, but increasingly to big agribusiness. So this is what the Democratic lawmaker said. He said, what the farmers do is very interesting. The agricultural people from North Carolina, where agriculture means tobacco, discuss their problems with the man representing rice growers in Arkansas or California, the sugar beet growers in Minnesota, and sugarcane interests in Louisiana and Hawaii, and the wheat and corn and soybean and other producers just gather together in one great big happy family. To be sure, there is a subsidy for every commodity. They put those numbers together again so that they have at least 218 supporters in the House and 51 in the Senate. A supporter of the tobacco subsidy automatically becomes a supporter of the wheat subsidy or the sugar quota or whatever else follows. So this aspect of congressional politics reveals the importance of economic interest in the policymaking process as opposed to ideas. As I said just a bit earlier, once you extend the legislative jurisdiction and the taxation powers of the national government, Congress becomes very vulnerable to this type of policymaking. I should also note that it's this type of policymaking that is, in a way, most bipartisan. Both parties, for various reasons, the reasons can change over time a little bit, both parties accept these kinds of interest group politics precisely because they don't see any political advantage from hammering the groups that benefit at the expense of the public from these policies. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't other advantages to bipartisan policymaking. We'll discuss some of the advantages of bipartisan policymaking during the middle part of the 20th century next week. I thought I'd start out with the negative side of the textbook Congress and move to the more positive side next week. I think in some ways it is easier for us to appreciate the positive elements of mid-20th century bipartisanship, but we should take the time to see that bipartisan is not a synonym for good. Okay, I hope that you have found this is helpful. Let me just review a few of the major points from the lecture. We're trying to understand the institutional development of Congress, and we're trying to look at the development of Congress as a process which depends upon a mix of centripetal and centrifugal forces. Centripetal forces are the forces that bring power towards the center, the forces that tend to make Congress act in a more parliamentary fashion on the basis of something that looks like partisan discipline, or party discipline, excuse me. Centrifugal forces are the forces that bring power away from the center and allow greater independence for individuals. So for most of the 19th century, Congress was dominated by centripetal forces. Congress acted in the more parliamentary fashion. Party leaders were able to act at least a little bit like prime ministers in a parliamentary system. They had a considerable amount of control over individual members. As you go into the 20th century, that changes. Centrifugal forces start to predominate, and we've talked about some of the reasons why. The institutional basis of the textbook system was the seniority system in Congress. This gives independent power to committees and committee chairs because the use of the seniority system took away the most important tool, or one of the most important tools, that party leaders use to discipline individual members. Now, we should also keep in mind, of course, the connection between the seniority system, the incumbency advantage, and the unusual power of Southern Democrats within the textbook system. Politically, this is the most significant fact about the textbook Congress of the 20th century, and certainly its most significant deficiency. But I've also talked about another deficiency of congressional policymaking in terms of the responsiveness of Congress to interest group rent seeking and the way in which this is facilitated by legislative log rolling across different committees. Next week, we'll talk about some of the advantages of the textbook system and how, in some circumstances, the textbook system of Congress facilitated decisive and beneficial policy changes. It's not all about rent seeking. It's not all about Southerners defending segregation, though it was a lot about that as well. We'll also talk about how the textbook system fell apart and how political polarization has shaped the lawmaking process in Congress as a whole in the contemporary era. And I suspect we'll also find some time to talk about Donald Trump. All right, enjoy the rest of your week, and please let me know if you have any questions about the lecture or really anything else. Take care.